Last Sunday, I left the meeting house just before the service ended because I needed to go practice the Christmas pageant song with the kids over in the chapel. And when we had finished practicing, I showed them a packet which contained some gifts for each family, including a short booklet about Christmas around the world, and then a color picture of a manger with some stickers of Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus. And on the front of the packet, I had placed a sticker that said, "Advent is here, let's wait together, love, Amy." And so I asked them, why is Advent a season of waiting? What are we waiting for? And they were pretty quick to say they were waiting for Christmas, a little less quick to say they were waiting for Jesus to be born, and not yet aware that we also wait for something to be born inside of each of us in the season of Advent. There's been so much going on in the life of our church for the last few months that I find myself looking forward to that deep quiet, that special silence that descends on Christmas Eve when all the waiting is over and the busyness of the preparations is behind us. And it feels frustrating sometimes to feel all that pressure of those things when what I really want to do is just slip off to a quiet place like Jesus often did and sit in silence. I chose just a few brief verses from Mark's Gospel today because I wonder if some of you are longing for that kind of silence. I wonder if the holiday season, all its planning and lists and activities, leaves you wishing you had a quiet moment by yourself, maybe in the morning when it's still dark, or in the silence of the late night when all the people around you are asleep. The disciples did not understand that silent prayer was so important to Jesus' ministry, to his ability to be present with people and to follow the path that God had set before him. They sounded confused and maybe even a little incredulous when they find him off by himself. "What are you doing?" they say. "Everyone's looking for you. We got things to do and people to see and places to go." And graciously, Jesus does not respond in kind. He's not in a rush. He may have felt the pressure or the expectations piling up around him, but he takes it in stride. I think Jesus was able to simply follow Simon back to the others and continue along their way through Galilee because he had taken that time to sit in silence and pray. He knew he needed to push the reset button. You know what I mean, when your phone or your computer aren't working and you're struggling to get them to work and finally you realize, oh, I better just shut everything down and start again. So that's what Jesus was doing in the dark of that early morning. He was sitting in silence, listening and praying and talking to God. And I suggest to you today that we need to cultivate that kind of silence, to find and take those moments as Jesus did so that we can hear what God is calling to be born in us. The sermon title today, Silence, was carefully chosen from among other words like quiet or stillness or privacy or peace, because while quiet is the absence of noise and stillness the absence of movement and privacy the absence of intrusion and peace, the absence of war, silence is about the presence of God. I can't really help you all sort through what you might need to leave out of your days or your mind or your heart, but I can help remind you that one of the most important things to make room for is for the presence of God. As I mentioned, it's been a particularly busy few months in the life of our church, our transitions in the music ministry, our stewardship campaign, and discussion of our budget realities and pastoral matters for a number of families, and growth in the involvement of our families and children in our programming means a fullness that's both exciting and challenging, not unlike what the period of Advent is intended to be, exciting and challenging. We're preparing the way not just for Christ to be born, but for the birth of whatever newness, whatever clarity, whatever vision is ahead for our church. We are preparing the way for our future. We are laying the ground for the next generation of this Church of Christ, and it's not easy work, my friends. We have some hard choices to make. Some among us have spent many hours listening, talking, praying, and thinking creatively about what we are called to be doing and where we see our church in the next 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 years. Advent literally means the arrival of what is to come. It is a preparation, a time for reflection and waiting, a time for prayer and listening. It's exactly what our church needs right now. About a month ago, I started reading a book called Silence, the Power of Quiet in a World Full of Noise by Thich Nhat Hanh, who some of you probably recognize as he's a Buddhist writer and teacher. And in his book, he discusses the kinds of stimuli that we all encounter in our daily life, and he suggests that we ingest a lot more than just food into our bodies every day. We ingest sensory impressions, we ingest our volition, meaning like our will or our desire, and finally our consciousness, or how our mind feeds itself by our thoughts and actions. We create a lot of those things inside ourselves. And I mention these simply to note that silence, as all of you know, is profoundly affected by all that we ingest. So if we're taking in all these things, we are easily distracted or pulled away from silence by a growling stomach or the scent of a certain perfume, or by our desire for vindication, or by a cycle of negative thoughts and inner criticism that continue in our mind. So finding silence in our mind or in our heart or in our body is a lot more complicated than we would hope. And speaking of hope, that's what we are calling to us, what we are recognizing and looking for today on this first Sunday of Advent. We hope that God's promise of light in the darkness will remain visible, since along the way this past year, we may have become lost and unable to see what's ahead. Now, the Guerra family just encouraged us as they lit the Advent wreath to listen for the prophetic word of hope, so that in moments of doubt or fear, we might find strength and calm. The clearest and best place to feel that hope is in the silence within ourselves, because that is the place we can find the strength and calm that we need. The trouble is that many of us are not accustomed to silence. As I mentioned, we understand quiet as the absence of noise and stillness as the absence of movement, but silence, it's something a little more elusive. And as you know, I often turn to poetry when I'm trying to understand or glimpse parts of something that I do not yet understand. I appreciate the wisdom that I find in Scripture, though I can often relate on a deeper human level when I read poets whose words leave room in between them for consideration, for mulling things over, and for the space to admit that I really don't grasp something that I thought I did. There are moments after I read a poem that I can confess my arrogance or my pride, my privilege or my assumptions, which always lead me into trouble instead of into understanding. And so I offer just a few very short poems today, beginning with one from our current poet laureate of the United States, Tracy K. Smith. It's entitled Charity. She is like a squat old machine, off kilter but still chugging along the uphill stretch of sidewalk on Harrison Street, handbag slung crosswise and I'm guessing heavy. And oh, the set of her face, her brows profound tracks, her mouth cinched, lips pressed flat. Watching her bend forward to tussle with gravity, watching the birth she allows each foot as if one is not on civil terms with the other, watching her shoulders braced as if lashed by step after step after step, and her eyes' determination not to shift or blink or rise, I think, I am you, one day out of 5, tired, empty, hating what I carry but afraid to lay it down, stingy, angry, doing violence to others by the sheer freight of my own gloom, halfway home, wanting to stop, to quit, but keeping going mostly out of spite. I wonder who among us here today is having that one day in 5. In this season so full of perceived obligations and required commitments, what is it that you are carrying which you hate but are afraid to lay down? And how is it that weight causing you to be angry or do violence to the people you love or other undeserving strangers? Sometimes a poem offers up a mirror and then maybe a reflection that you do not recognize. I imagine that when Jesus stole away to the garden or wandered alone in the desert, he was looking first for quiet and then for silence too. He was seeking God's presence, not so much the absence of noise. How is it that we keep trudging up that hill, spiteful and burdened, instead of letting go? Instead of stopping to rest and then realizing that the heaviness we bear is so often the weight of our own inner noise. Tracy Smith has traveled all over the country sharing her poems and love of poetry and teaching in her role as poet laureate, and she says, "A good poem is never going to follow the well-worn path of habit. Language urges you to push against what you might think you know, what you might initially be inclined to draw from what you've observed, and even what you believe. That's exciting because you're wandering away from the things that you feel confident of, and you're wandering into a place where, oh, maybe you're not so right. Maybe you're vulnerable in ways that you hadn't anticipated, and maybe the vulnerability that you're willing to claim isn't the whole story." I think what she's saying is that a good poem can open us right up. In a few words, we get right to the heart of things. A story we recognize, a feeling we've known, a flaw seen now, not as a deficit, but simply as something to be accepted, part of who we are, made, as God reminds us, in God's own image. A good poem reminds us of other people's stories, the stories of our neighbors, our spouses and partners, our children, the children and families all over the world, the children in Yemen, the stories of immigrants waiting to gain entry into this country, or the refugees from Syria all around the world waiting to see if they will ever be able to return home. In a good poem, we find ourselves on a human level that we can all understand. We can even consider the mysteries of what we do not yet understand, as in the next poem called Such Silence by Mary Oliver. As deep as I ever went into the forest, I came upon an old stone bench, very, very old, and around it a clearing, and beyond that, trees taller and older than I had ever seen. Such silence. It really wasn't so far from town, but it seemed all the clocks in the world had stopped counting. So it was hard to suppose the usual rules applied. Sometimes there's only a hint, a possibility. What's magical sometimes has deeper roots than reason. I hope everyone knows that. I sat on the bench waiting for something, an angel, perhaps, or dancers with legs of goats. No, I didn't see either, but only, I think, because I didn't stay long enough. Arriving at silence takes practice. It takes time, and I think that's why Jesus so often left without telling the disciples where he'd gone. If you think it was hard for Jesus to find silence, think of how much more challenging it is now to find quiet or solitude or silence today. We're assaulted by pings and beeps and tweets and rings and by 24-hour news cycle and flashy headlines. It's why Mary Oliver spends so much time outside every day, walking deep into the forest to sit on an old stone bench and wait for whatever unexpected thing might appear, and even then, you might not be able to stay long enough to see it. Jesus was fully engaged in the world. He was pushed to his limit, in fact. So much traveling and speaking and thinking and serving, all of it good, but he needed to cultivate silence, to invite and then to listen to God inside himself. The author Gunilla Norris writes in a meditation about silence that it's both something we're afraid of and long for at the same time. Silence brings us back to basics, to our senses, to ourselves. It locates us. Without that return to ourselves, we can go so far away from our true natures that we end up quite literally beside ourselves. I think that's what Advent's all about, a return to ourselves as God's children. Just as Jesus, God's child, is born to us every Christmas, so we are born again as God's children ourselves. Each year, in a never-ending cycle, we have the opportunity to reflect on what is coming, to anticipate our rebirth, to be inspired by our own imaginations and by God's creative power as we wait, seeking to clear away the noise, the clutter, and the weight of what we carry through the year, to be filled instead with God through a mind and a heart that are clear and open. I wonder if any of you have heard of 4 minutes 33 seconds by the American experimental composer John Cage. It premiered on August 29th, 1952 at a concert hall in Woodstock, New York as part of a recital of contemporary music, and the audience saw John Cage sit at the piano and mark the beginning of the piece by closing the keyboard lid on the piano. And sometime later, he opened it briefly to mark the end of the first movement. And this process was repeated for the second and the third movements, and the piece lasted for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, all of it consisting of silence. Now, the Wikipedia entry about this piece explains that in 1951, he had visited an anechoic chamber at Harvard University, and that is a chamber, it's a room that is designed in such a way that the walls and the ceiling and the floor absorb all the sounds made in the room rather than reflecting them as echoes. And it's also externally soundproofed. And when he entered that chamber expecting to hear silence, what he wrote about later was, I heard 2 sounds, one high and one low. And when he described it to the engineer in charge, when he got out of the booth, he was informed that the high one was his nervous system in operation, and the low one was his blood in circulation. And so Cage had gone to a place where he expected total silence, and yet what he heard were 2 sounds. And he said, until I die, there will be sounds, and they will continue following my death, and one not ever need to fear the future of music, because there is always sound. And I think what he learned, and what's so challenging for all of us to understand, is that silence is not an external thing, it's an internal one. Cultivating silence is certainly more easily achieved in a quiet place, and yet the absence of sound is not required for us to find internal silence. Indeed, a total absence of sound in a world full of noise is practically impossible. Perhaps it's more about the way we experience silence that's important. Maybe our work is not to erase or dismiss the sounds of a full life, but to integrate them into the melody of our lives, knowing that no matter where we find ourselves, that internal silence that we can practice cultivating is always with us. It's something that we carry. Maybe the opposite of silence isn't noise, but all those sounds coming together, a kind of singing. The last short poem is called The Real Work by Wendell Berry. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work, and that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. When you find yourself in that place where you don't know what to do next, that place where you aren't sure which way to turn or what lies ahead, know that the real work has just begun in you. The noise that surrounds us may feel overwhelming at times, distracted as we are by all those things that Thich Nhat Hanh so clearly describes that we ingest, those things that make it feel so challenging to cultivate internal silence. When the noise of our lives does its best to drown out the silence, to obscure the drumbeat of your heart and the high-pitched yearning of your nervous system, remember it's the bumps, twists, and curves along the way that make the path of your life interesting, and it's sounds of your life, of all our lives together, that come together to make a chorus that is a celebration. At the other end of the spectrum, the celebration of joyful noise, which is also God in us. It is the voice of God that speaks to us in silence and sings to us in choruses of God's voices together.
As I went walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway, and saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. Join us. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, and I followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts. And all around me, a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. Last time is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
Thanks, you guys.